So Murray Rothbard, what the point that he would always stress is that people pay too much attention to the kind of tax, and what's more important is the height of the tax. And in Man, Economy, and State, he explains how all taxes eventually get borne by land and labor, and so really. Again, that's what's more important. Related to the brigands, someone posted a question on YouTube saying that, well, the government protects us from brigands, so it doesn't make sense to think of them as brigands. Now, if you go back to the story and you think about it, so say the brigands come in and they become kings and nobles and they plunder through taxation, are they going to like it if other brigands come in and start looting their subjects? No. Why not? Yeah. If other brigands loot the people and makes them poorer, then it's less for the government brigands to plunder. So it makes them poorer. So of course they're going to want to protect them from other brigands because they're saying, hey, these are our victims. Stay out of this. With the mob, with the mafia, it's what you call a protection racket. But with the government, we call it the social contract.
Just, again, a small comment on consumption tax. A lot of people have proposed replacing the income tax with some kind of maybe a value-added tax or some other kind of consumption tax. It's an interesting point. But to echo what Danny said, in addition to the level of the tax being more important than the specific collection procedure, there are also a number of interesting practical and sort of political difficulties, I think, with most of those proposals. So their proponents have in mind that we will institute a VAT or some other kind of consumption tax, and then after that start, reducing income taxes and other kinds of business taxes on business and so forth. Kind of politically speaking, that doesn't seem like a very wise strategy, because a new tax almost always historically has simply been added on to the set of existing taxes. I think it would be very difficult to strike that kind of political bargain where you could actually get a substitution rather than the addition of yet another tax.
I think that also points out how the Austrians are different from mainstream economists. Mainstream economists sort of invent these ways of making alterations in government that supposedly will make us better off if all the equations work out correctly and all the estimates come out correctly. Austrians are very realistic about their economic theory, but we're also realists when it comes to economic policy. And, a tax, government almost never gives up on a tax, gives up on a regulation, gives up on a bureaucracy. They're sitting on like 29,000 empty buildings that they refuse to sell off. They never give things up. They only are interested in taking more. Remember that Richard Nixon, August 15th, 1971, took us off the gold standard temporarily. To what extent are taxes constitutional?
Well, I mean, that's a political question and a good question. I mean, the Constitution does explicitly provide for certain kinds of government fees. It depends what you mean by constitutional. Does that mean what was in the original document, or what most people think what constitutional means today is whatever is the latest decision of the U.S. Supreme Court? So by that standard, everything that the government is currently doing is constitutional. If you mean, did the founders have in mind anything like the kind of system that we have today? I think, the answer is obviously not. Just to give you one illustration, when the income tax was first introduced during the Progressive era, or in the 19 teens, the top marginal rate wasn't it 2%? So the most that you could be taxed, even on your extra income at the very top, was 2%, and a lot of people thought that was outrageous. But that was the only way they could get it passed, by promising that most Americans would never pay any income tax, only a few, millionaires, and the amount they pay, would be teeny tiny. So that's one way of, what would the voters and people in Congress who approved the income tax in 1913, what would they think of the current tax structure or the tax structure in the U.S. in the 1970s and 80s? I suspect they would be somewhat surprised.
Now, one thing is that the income tax for certain periods was considered unconstitutional. But they actually amended the Constitution with the 16th Amendment, which allowed for an income tax, even though before the 16th Amendment, Abraham Lincoln actually imposed an income tax anyway. So, yeah.
Just as we learned just a couple of years ago, the Supreme Court has now decided that a law requiring people to purchase goods and services from private vendors, namely health insurance contracts, is constitutional because that's a form of tax. So to answer your question, we'd have to say, what does the Supreme Court think that taxation is? And apparently any expenditure that the government compels, either to the government or to a private company, could be considered a tax, and according to the Supreme Court, is constitutional.
Oh, you heard of the Articles of Confederation? That's the document, the agreement between the states that Americans used to defeat Great Britain and become independent of Great Britain. There was no power to tax under the Articles of Confederation. The only thing that they could do is make requisitions from the states. And so they didn't have taxing power. And everything worked out pretty well, except a small number of states within the Articles of Confederation could block anything. So a minority of states, you needed more than a majority in order to pass something. And so the delegates would go there and meet in Philadelphia, and they couldn't tax, and it was really hard to pass anything. And the little small states could block the big states from doing certain things, and the big states could block the little states for doing certain things. And so it wasn't fun as far as politicians go. So they decided to rip up the document and start over again with the U.S. Constitution, which does have some taxing powers in it. Okay, thank you very much. It's been a great day.